Sejam bem-vindos aqui ao canal. Hoje eu vou trazer um vídeo onde falo a respeito das tarifas que o presidente dos Estados Unidos aplicou sobre o Brasil e quais os efeitos disso. E já vou adiantando aqui que pelo jeito não está saindo como ele planejava. Enfim, antes eu gostaria de pedir a vocês que inscrevessem aqui em nosso canal, deixassem também o seu like e a sua opinião.
48 U.S. coffee shipments were turned away overnight, and while Americans brace for higher prices, Brazil is sealing billion-dollar deals with new partners abroad. The question is, has Washington just handed over the future of your morning cup? Coffee isn't just another drink in the United States, it's part of daily life. From the first morning cup to the midday pick-me-up, the demand is enormous. According to fresh USDA data, Americans consume over 24.5 million bags every year, averaging about 10.8 pounds per person. That works out to a market worth roughly $3.72 billion, a staggering figure that shows how deeply coffee is woven into the country's culture. It isn't a luxury here, it's a lifeline for millions who can't start their day without it.
22% of the imports in 2024, and about 20% on average over the last 5 years, so growing in importance. You're right, I think that coffee competitors and coffee shops are going to really find...
The issue is that the U.S. doesn't really grow coffee on a large scale. The crop needs very specific conditions: tropical climates, high altitudes, and steady rainfall. That makes it nearly impossible to grow across most of the country. Only Hawaii and Puerto Rico have suitable land, with some experimental farms in Southern California, but their combined output is barely a drop compared to national demand. These beans are often marketed as specialty products with higher prices, never enough to supply mainstream shelves.
A little bit of a different taste profile, but my palate's not that sophisticated.
Clearly mine's not either. Andrew, thank you for joining us today on All Things Coffee.
This heavy dependence is why Brazil matters so much. The South American giant supplies around 30% of all coffee imported into the U.S., making it the single largest source. In simple terms, 1 in every 3 cups you drink is likely Brazilian. That dominance isn't an accident. Brazil produces more coffee than any other country on Earth, benefiting from vast growing regions, established infrastructure, and a century of experience supplying the global market. For the U.S., that has meant steady shipments of affordable beans for decades.
American wallets.
At Boomtown, mornings just wouldn't be the same without that first cup.
Brazil's Arabica beans in particular have been the quiet backbone of American coffee culture. They aren't flashy or exotic, but they deliver exactly what roasters need: consistency and reliability at a price that works. These beans form the base of blends at household names like Starbucks, Dunkin', Tim Hortons, Maxwell House, and even supermarket brands like Kirkland. When you think about the smooth, mild flavor that defines everyday coffee, chances are you're tasting Brazilian Arabica. It is the glue that holds together the country's coffee supply chain.
You're going to want to hear this. It might be about to get a lot more expensive in the United States because of Trump's tariffs.
This dependence creates a fragile situation. Because the U.S. relies so heavily on Brazil, any disruption hits fast and hard. Unlike other goods where domestic factories can ramp up production, there's no backup plan for... If imports slow down or costs rise, consumers feel it almost immediately at the checkout line. What makes this worse is that the U.S. has built its coffee identity around affordability. People expect their cup to be cheap and available everywhere, from diners to gas stations. Without Brazil's steady flow, that balance becomes almost impossible to maintain.
As of mid-2025. In short, coffee drinkers across the country are likely to pay more in the coming months, be it at their neighborhood cafe or...
The turning point came on August 1st, 2025, when Washington imposed a 50% tariff on all Brazilian coffee imports. Overnight, the steady flow of beans that fueled American homes and businesses became entangled in political drama. President Trump framed it as an effort to level the playing field. But in reality, it was a gamble that turned coffee into a weapon in the trade war. The world's largest consumer was suddenly at odds with its largest supplier, and the fallout was immediate.
I think that the coffee trade is more emblematic of an attempt to use tariffs as a one-size-fits-all foreign policy.
Brazil didn't take the move quietly. The next day in Sao Paulo, Brazil's president declared, "I will not humiliate myself," refusing any negotiation or concession. That statement wasn't just defiance, it was a signal that Brazil wouldn't bend under U.S. pressure. Traders around the world took note, and contracts that had been secure for decades began to unravel. Washington had pulled the trigger, but Brazil showed it had its own arsenal, and the standoff instantly rattled the market.
31% of our coffee in the United States from Brazil. It's a big deal. What's interesting is that the Brazilian real and Brazilian markets haven't necessarily plummeted on the headlines, and the more adverse.
The effect hit American roasters almost immediately. Contracts with Brazilian suppliers had to be rewritten or abandoned, and importers scrambled to find alternative sources. Within the first week, shipments of Brazilian coffee to the U.S. dropped 18% compared to the previous year. This wasn't because Brazil lacked coffee. The country still produced more than a third of the world's supply. The problem was that the tariff erased their competitive edge in the U.S., making it nearly impossible to sell beans at the prices American buyers depended on. Prices spiked with shocking speed. Earlier in the year, a pound of ground coffee sold for about $6.90 to $7.10 on average. After the tariff, that same pound climbed to $8.13 nationwide, crossing the $9 mark in states like California and New York. For families consuming 3 to 4 pounds a month, that added an extra $36 to $60 a year. On paper, it might not sound devastating, but for households already battling rising costs of food and fuel, it became one more burden they couldn't ignore.
To offset an upcoming 50% tariff that Washington will impose on select Brazilian goods, including coffee.
When Washington slapped a 50% tariff on Brazilian coffee, many assumed Brazil would be cornered. After all, losing the U.S., the second largest coffee consumer in the world, seemed like a crushing blow. But Brazil didn't blink. Instead, it turned outward, using the crisis as an opportunity to redraw the trade map. Within days, officials and exporters began signing new deals, showing that their coffee didn't need America to stay relevant. What looked like a trap quickly became a chance to expand into markets with more stability and less political risk.
A very solid trading partner, and I think there's been much alignment in the past, especially even with geopolitics and foreign policy goals. The BRICS pushed back against
China was the first major player to step in. Barely 3 days after the tariff announcement, Beijing granted export licenses to over 220 Brazilian coffee companies. For Brazil, this was a breakthrough. China's coffee consumption has been rising at one of the fastest rates in the world, fueled by young urban professionals and a booming cafe culture in cities like Shanghai and Beijing. What once was considered a tea nation is rapidly developing a taste for espresso and lattes. By welcoming Brazilian exporters with open arms, China offered not just an alternative, but a billion-strong consumer base that could reshape the global coffee landscape. Europe followed closely behind. In Germany, retail giant Ruva signed a memorandum of understanding with a Brazilian cooperative that had once supplied U.S. roasters. This deal wasn't just symbolic, it laid the groundwork for long-term partnerships that could lock in steady supplies to one of Europe's biggest coffee markets. The European Union has always had strong coffee ties, but Brazil's sudden availability made it even more attractive. With no tariffs and predictable demand, the EU offered what the U.S. could no longer guarantee: stability. South Korea and Japan also joined the rush. Both countries already rank among the top importers of specialty and commercial-grade coffee. By securing more Brazilian beans, they not only ensured reliable supply for their growing coffee cultures, but also sent a message. The U.S. wasn't the only customer worth courting. Brazil's willingness to redirect shipments so quickly showed just how much leverage it held in the market. While American roasters scrambled to find alternatives, Asian buyers were locking in contracts and preparing to secure their blends for years to come. This pivot wasn't just about moving shipments, it was about power. By finding billion-dollar alternatives almost overnight, Brazil stripped away America's leverage in the trade relationship. For decades, the U.S. had positioned itself as the gravitational center of global coffee, setting standards, demanding supply, and assuming its place as the customer every producer wanted to serve. But once Brazil demonstrated it could sell elsewhere without suffering, that illusion shattered. The U.S. was no longer the destination every exporter relied on. It had become just another buyer, and one with unpredictable rules. For American businesses, this shift was sobering. Losing easy access to Brazilian beans meant higher costs, less consistency, and tougher competition against global rivals who were still getting the coffee at lower prices. Meanwhile, Brazil was building stronger ties with regions that promised growth and political calm. In a matter of weeks, the trade war turned the U.S. from a central hub into a market on the sidelines. Brazil's defiance had done more than resist a tariff, it had rewritten the balance of power in the coffee world.
Então é isso, gostaria muito de agradecer eles por ter acompanhado aqui. Também pedir eles novamente que não esqueçam de inscrever-se aqui em nosso canal. Deixe aí também o seu like e também a sua opinião.